Welcome to the Inquisitive Minds podcast. This podcast is all about searching for answers to questions oftentimes unexplained or unexplored. We want to engage with new and sometimes old theories, psychology, or philosophy from a research based perspective. Hello, and welcome to the fourth episode of the Inquisitive Minds podcast, where we talk about anything that we want to talk about. And today, that's the definition of it, because instead of philosophy, instead of psychology, instead of something on the leading edge of technology, we're doing a social program, and that is the universal basic income. And it's kind of on the leading edge of of critical thinking nowadays, because it's kind of a new concept, and you may have heard of it from the same person we did, and that was Andrew Yang. He was running to be the Democratic nominee for the 2020 presidential election in the United States. And he had this pretty interesting idea called universal basic income. And what he called it was the freedom dividend. And we would like to dive into that whole idea, kind of go a little bit more into a UBI, which is what we'll be calling it, a UBI system that is either different or more comprehensive, or just give you a general idea of the different varieties that it could take on and potential benefits, potential downfalls. We'll get into everything. But right now, Johnny, how are you doing? What do you think of this UBI topic?
I'm doing pretty good. I'm fairly passionate about UBI. I think it's well, I won't say what I think of it yet, but I think it's a very topical issue. I see it brought up a lot, talks a lot in current day. So I think I like it because it's topical. I think that's why we sort of chose it. And especially with everything that's going on with like the pandemic and everything, and like Canadian government with CERB and stuff, sort of getting something that's similar to it.
Yeah, for sure. I think this one, like you said, is topical. It's interesting. It's a little bit out of our wheelhouse, and really it's kind of unexplored. And the research itself is fairly new. I think that's what I found going through it. A lot of studies either from 2018 or 2019, right when the idea became mainstream.
Yeah,
So,
there's not too many long term studies,
mhm,
which is sort of this unfortunate thing. Like there's some decent amount of studies, but they either sort of finish or like a switch in government sort of cancels them.
yeah,
And with like I think Alaska having something very similar to it
mhm.
is sort of the longest running study.
Yeah. Since you brought it up, do you want to go ahead and explain fully what's going on in Alaska with their kind of system?
In Alaska, it's called the Alaska Permanent Fund,
Okay.
and it uses all the revenues from the oil industry and gives a like a lump sum fund to all its citizens.
Okay.
So it's a one time a year cash transfer, unconditional cash transfer. So
Right.
like sometimes it can be $1,000, 2,000. It varies year to year depending on how much they make from oil. So just being an Alaska citizen, you get a check once a year, free money.
Right. And we'll get into why that's very similar to what we're talking about, and maybe a little bit different than some of the systems we would think to put in place. So let's go back and let's kind of take a look at a little bit of history, like we like to do. So what I found was the first real mention of anyone ever talking about something that is guaranteed income was in Sir Thomas More's book, which he wrote called Utopia, and that was in 1516. From there, it was kind of discarded and was only ever mentioned again recently in history by Thomas Paine, one of the founders of the United States Constitution, right? One of the founding fathers. That was in 1797, and what he proposed in Britain prior to the United States Revolution, I believe, is he proposed a once per generation inheritance tax, essentially an estate tax. So, like individuals who owned land, when they died off, a certain amount of the money that that was being passed down to the next generation was given to the government. And this was back when the yearly wage in England was approximately, or the yearly amount of money to stay over the poverty line was £23. That's like $23 in UK, and he was insisting we can give every man and woman £15 a year if we institute this estate tax, which only taxes the individuals once per generation, which is like fair, seems like a fairly good idea. You can imagine the pushback from people who did own land, though. Then the next biggest one, a case for universal basic income, is Milton Friedman, who was a philosopher in the United States, and his idea was a negative income tax. So his negative income tax idea is essentially, okay, we set the limit. Let's say you have to make $50,000 a year to be above the poverty line. If you don't make that much money above, it's you aren't taxed on your income. Instead, let's say you make $25,000 a year, you're given a certain amount of money back up to $50,000. So what he was kind of saying was, okay, let's say we give you 50% of what you didn't make. So if the bar is $50,000 a year and you make 25, well then 25 divided by 2 is how much you'd get back. So what's that, 1375 or something like that?
Well, the negative tax would be boost you up to that threshold.
Yeah, that was one model. Or it was like to incentivize not working. So like let's say if you made $0, the government wouldn't just give you $50,000, right? They'd give you
Hmm.
$25,000, half of what you didn't
Gotcha.
make up to that amount. So
And
there's
then
there's certain
and
ways you can play with
also
that though, right? Yeah.
yeah, and then also if you're making more than that threshold, what you're being taxed on is only the excess.
hmm
So if you're
So
making 55, you're only getting taxed on the 500 or the
r-
5,000, sorry.
yeah, so that was one sort of way of changing the welfare system to help those who are below the poverty line, whatever it may be. So that was an interesting one that people kind of looked at and almost was implemented, right, Johnny? What did you?
In 1969, Nixon proposed a bill reconstructing the entire welfare system with a negative income tax. It blew through the House, but it died in the Senate
Hmm.
because I've heard they wanted it to be more.
It wasn't good
But
enough. Yeah.
it's just crazy. In like 1968, the year before, when sort of Nixon got the idea for all this, was um, a letter to Congress came from over 1,000 economists signed this letter,
hmm
and just it went on about how they think it's sort of like feasible and believe the costs of such plans are substantial but well within the nation's economic and fiscal capacity. And in the letter writes, as economists, we offer the professional opinion that income guarantees and supplements are feasible and compatible with our economic system. As citizens, we feel strongly that the time for action is now. And then the next year, he proposed the negative income tax.
Right. And unfortunately, it hasn't come to be, but it
Yeah,
was
sadly.
it was an interesting, especially. I mean, Nixon is known as I mean, he was a right wing politician, but
Yeah.
usually these kind of social programs are more left leaning, and he was the one to put it forward. So that's like an interesting part of history, that
And
recent history in it.
that's that's sort of one of the things about UBI is that it doesn't seem like it's a left or a right. It seems it's very bipartisan,
hmm
which is very fascinating to me
Yeah.
personally.
So I want to go over some things that shape what a UBI is. Like what what do we mean when we say this? So firstly, universality. It's a tough one to say for me, but essentially, is everyone encompassed under this? That's what makes it universal, right? So what what is that scope? Is it, okay, you're a citizen, or is it a household? Is it what's the age bracket? So these things all need to be defined, right? So on average, most countries would assume, if you wanted to institute this, most countries would say, okay, you're of age, so you're an adult. Perhaps that's 21 in the US, maybe it's 18 in other countries, maybe it's less, maybe it's 16, and you're a citizen in our country. So that's pretty much the universe, and then everybody gets the dollar amount. So that's one thing. The other thing would be conditions. For example, when we talk about welfare a little later on, there's a lot of conditions around it. So the UBI system is trying to cut conditions. It's trying to make it as easy as possible for you to get. That's one of the big benefits that we're going to talk about. So essentially, you don't have to be in school. Um, you don't have to be trying to find jobs. You don't have to be working. You just get the money. There's no condition for most of these. And then uniformity across. So we're going to talk about, is it hard to make this dollar amount equal across the United States? So let's say everybody gets $1,000 a month in our system. Well, people live in areas that cost more, right? You have different costs of living. Should we make it just $1 amount across the whole board, or should we try to fluctuate depending on where you live? And then we have to talk about frequency, like do we do it like Alaska? They get a lump sum once a year, or do we do it once a month? Do we do it every 2 weeks, like you get a normal paycheck kind of thing? We have to talk about that when creating UBI, and then maybe we want to think about lastly is the mode in which you get the money. Does it come in food stamps? Does everybody needs to eat? Does it is it instituted as cash? Is it instituted in a different way? These are all the things we want to try to figure out when we're making our UBI system. John, you have any thoughts about that?
No, I think you kind of covered sort of some of the questions that suppose people would be interested in.
Hmm.
And the way I personally would sort of define it would be like an unconditional income that is sufficient to meet a person's basic needs.
Hmm.
And it's like, it's so it's different to the welfare system in like instead of using a net to catch people when they fall, it's to raise the floor on which everyone stands. Is sort of how I see it.
Hmm. And that can go also when we talk about universal basic income. We talked about universal, but what about basic income? So what do we define as basic income, right? And that can be, like you said, a floor, which is the minimum amount of money you need to live and not be in poverty. And if the government were to give that much out, that'd be called a full basic income. So let's say it's fifty thousand
Mm-hmm.
dollars, like I said, everybody gets $50,000 a year from the government. That's a full basic income. Then there's partial basic incomes, which are probably more realistic. So if we go with the Andrew Yang approach, the $1,000 a month, that's only $12,000 a year. He said this many times in his run up. He said that's not enough to live on. People are still going to want to work. People still need to work. It's just
Mm-hmm.
enough to float yourself and kind of give you a platform to stand on, like you said, Johnny. So with that, I want to transition into some of the arguments against it. So what did you find were kind of like the big things that people would initially say, no, 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 we can't do this because.
Well, the big two I found a lot was the cost,
Hmm.
and it will make people lazy and not work.
Yeah.
Which one is very easy to dispel, and the other one is more speculative and has a lot of questions around it.
Hmm.
So the free money will make people lazy and not work as much, and with less work, less tax revenue, and less money for the state and cities. And I think that is completely false.
Hmm.
It's kind of funny. It's almost sort of like human nature. Whereas like say someone asks you with like, oh, like here's $1,000 a month or whatever, it's less than what you live on. Would you still work? And you're like, yeah, of course. Like I still need to work. Yet you say yet when you think of other people, they're like, oh man, people are lazy, they're not gonna work. And it's like you just literally are like, I'm gonna work, but no one else is gonna work. I think it's sort of
Yeah.
that sort of fallacy.
I
So
think, yeah.
studies show so in there was American negative tax experiment, and only around 5% of hours work declined. The majority of the reduction was in two income households. So from like men, it was roughly like 1% of hours, and it was 3 to 5 for women.
Right. And that's probably because they're using that extra money to stay home on certain days and take care of their kids, right?
Exactly.
Yeah.
So
Okay.
it was a small reduction overall, mostly for them to take care of children or go back to school.
Hmm. Yeah. So that's one. That's the one that I think a lot of people. I agree with you. It's like, why why would we give free money out to everybody? They're just going to stop working. And I think that's part and parcel with the welfare trap. So I want to get into the welfare trap before we get into the second issue, which is costing, because that's going to
Mhm.
be a larger discussion. But
Oh,
the sorry,
before
what?
you let me like throw one more in like piece of
Yep,
evidence for
sure.
the lazy. So Alaska Permanent Fund I was mentioning earlier, it's been going on since 1976. So you're like, oh, like that's a huge study. That should be good data for people who are lazy and stuff, right? Very small decrease in work, but there was actually an increase in part-time jobs by 17%. The extra income let people buy more, which increased demand for service jobs. So there was
Right,
higher spending supported overall employment. It was actually like a benefit overall for employment,
right. That's interesting.
which is the complete opposite of what everyone would think, right?
Hmm. Yeah, you're actually adding jobs, right? And people are
Hmm.
working maybe a second part-time job, or maybe people who weren't working are able to get
Now,
part-time jobs now. Yeah,
like, yeah,
like new workers. To maybe you're 16 and you're looking for a job, can't find one. Well, now we have a job for you, right?
yeah,
That's
exactly.
interesting. Okay, so yeah, what I was gonna say
The
was
welfare trap.
welfare trap. Right. Thank you. So in the United States and in other developed nations, there's something called the welfare trap, where essentially, if you're on welfare, it's because you're making a certain amount of money that is not up to the poverty line in that area, in that state, city, whatever. So how it works is, let's say you apply. First, you have to do a whole load of paperwork. You have to say and prove that you're making a certain amount of money, and it has to be under a certain value. So let's say it's $1,000 a month. So if you're making $999 a month, you're eligible. And let's say in this welfare system, they give you $1,000. Let's try to make the numbers easy. So if you're making $999 from your part-time work, you qualify, and then the government gives you 1,000. You're left with a total of $1,999 in your pocket every month. But as soon as you start making $1,001, they take the welfare away from you. So you actually, instead of making, because you've maybe you got a raise or you work more hours, you're working harder, you make more money by yourself, the government takes away your welfare. So now instead of making $1,999, you're making $1,001, even though you worked more. This is called the welfare trap, and it incentivizes you to work less to continue to be eligible for their program. So this is part of the problem with people thinking that other people are lazy, that they're working less, while they're on welfare. It 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 doubles down this negative connotation of these people because they can't work more, or they suffer a hefty consequence of less money per month, right? It's
Mhm.
making it very hard for them to work more, and it's making it really hard for people to see that they can't work more, right? That's why the UBI system that we're talking about would be much easier for them, because instead of constraints on dollar amount and paperwork, they we get rid of all that and everybody gets a certain amount of money per month. Yeah, I
Shall
think
we speculate about sort of the costs of such programs?
sure.
Because that was the other big argument is
Mhm.
it's too expensive, right? Oh, actually, sorry, there's one more that I forgot to mention before we go into costs,
Mhm.
and is that the poor households or the poor people will use the money to buy alcohol, tobacco, or vices, etc.
Right. Yeah.
Which is another like which is also false. There was multiple studies, tons of studies in Africa giving poor people money. 19 studies show no significant impact on the money being spent on temptation goods. Very few show a small magnitude increase, and some even decrease.
Hmm.
So they gave people $1,000, and to break that down, $270 roughly was an increase in earnings, $330 increase in nutrition, $430 in more assets, and roughly $0 on alcohol. So these poor people were extremely making really good choices with the free money they had,
Yeah.
rather than sort of being forced to, like, say it's put into job training programs.
Hmm.
Just giving money directly to them ended up being way better.
Hmm. Yeah, that's interesting because I think I also was reading certain studies that were saying it's not the money these people would have to spend that makes them buy alcohol and tobacco. It's it's the fact that they're poor that they buy these. It's the stress of having little income to spend on anything else that makes these people resort to these kind of vices, right? So I
Oh
think
yeah.
that's another one that's easy to dissuade people. I mean, it'd be hard to truly convince people who have that in their mind, um, that is not the case for these people. But
Yeah.
it's true, right? We've seen it in research, and it's borne out in the research pretty frequently. And that's not even with the UBI studies. This is with other generic
Yeah.
studies about
Yeah.
poverty.
Cash transfers. Yeah.
Hmm. So now we get on to the big topic of if we were to institute this UBI system in, let's say, the United States, Canada, UK, other developed nations, like the cost and how would we cost it? Is it feasible? And why hasn't why hasn't it already been done? I mean, maybe it's a new idea, but what is the pushback cost wise? So, Johnny, what do you think? What are your initial thoughts for cost?
Well, well, it's so tough to sort of, like, that's why I sort of always say, like, kind of like we're like sort of speculating, right? Because, like, on one hand, that that letter to the Congress about all the economists saying that it's feasible makes me really want to believe that it's really feasible.
Hmm.
And, like, when I look at the numbers, it we're like, the numbers are off.
Hmm.
So it's roughly like what I found was in the US. I think it was in I think it was 2011 or whatever. They spent, excluding Social Security and Medicare, they spent around $1 trillion in welfare.
Yeah. Okay.
So around that same time, to give people around $12,000 a year, so $1,000 a month, it would cost them around 3 trillion.
Yeah, that's what I
with
had.
the UBI, that is a fixed stipend.
Hmm.
The negative income tax one was significantly cheaper, so that's probably why that was brought up during Nixon.
Hmm.
But so it's essentially, where are they going to come up with that trillion to $2 trillion, right?
Right. And that's the big question. We're going from
Mm-hmm.
1 trillion to 3 trillion. And if you don't know, $1 trillion is a shit ton. So you can't just you can't just make it come out of thin air. And we've seen, I think Andrew Yang proposed, okay, we're going to tax the top 1%. We're going to really try to make it so that they pay their fair share. We're going to, I mean, we saw in 2019 Amazon, the company did not pay a single dollar in in taxes in any way. So
Mm-hmm.
like stuff like that needs to stop. Closing loopholes. This is all a bigger conversation that I think both of us don't fully understand. But essentially, essentially, it's like, okay, we can tax the rich, but is it enough? And and at, and in the estimates, I think it wouldn't be enough. And also politically, it wouldn't be enough. To fully pass this in the future and in the near future, it would be it would be more of a compromise. I think you'd have to end up cutting some of the programs that are currently in circulation, right? So maybe that is the
Yeah.
welfare program. Maybe maybe that's other programs like disability pay, maybe it's unemployment insurance, maybe even it's social insurance, social
Hmm.
security. So that's if you're retired, you're getting certain amounts of money a month, um, stuff like that, right? So is it feasible to have this UBI system, and we're doing the $1,000 a month kind of as an example, and do we need to cut other services, or can we keep all the other services at the same time?
Well, I think it's important to keep, like, for, I guess, for the Americans, to keep Medicare and Social Security. I feel like you don't really touch those.
Yeah.
You definitely like cut all, or not all, at least majority of the welfare programs to at least get that trillion,
Mhm.
because if the welfare system was working it as really good as it really should, then would this really be something we'd be talking about at
Yeah.
this
Yeah.
time?
Hmm.
And so that's like around a trillion, and then yeah, like the taxing the wealthy wouldn't be enough. But I saw some suggestions which would be kind of taxes I would like to be kind of seen,
Okay.
would be like more taxes on carbon emissions,
Right.
um, maybe a tax on like cigarettes, on alcohol, more on the vices, gasoline, like a sugar tax. You see that popping up in Europe.
Yeah. And
And
yeah.
one of the things that Americans don't have is sort of a value added tax. It's like a consumption tax, which
S-
is sort of odd because like 160 countries all have this tax. So the
So,
Americans could potentially get a lot of money from that. That's one of the ways Yang was saying he really liked adding a value added tax.
so could you go ahead and explain maybe what the sugar tax would be and what the value added tax would be?
So with like a sugar tax, from my understanding, is like for the very sugary kind of like say like a chocolate bar,
Hmm.
or like chips or
Yeah.
anything
Yeah.
with loads of sugar, right? It would be taxed higher, like toward back to the government. So like the consumer would just have to pay more for these, which I
Right.
think is a good thing because it's
Yeah. Sugar is
negatively
known.
affecting health, right?
Yeah,
Which
it's
then
known to cause heart disease
which
and
then costs
diabetes.
money
Yeah,
on your healthcare system.
for sure. Okay, and then the other tax probably a little more complicated. What was that one?
Like a goods and services tax. It's like a consumption tax, as in it is taxed all along the supply chain. So like the manufacturer, the retailer, etc. It gets taxed all along the way,
Right.
rather than just the sales tax where it's right at the retailer, the sale.
Yeah.
And then there's a few other ways that I heard to kind of fund it. I heard a 35% flat tax for everybody would be able to fund it, which seems
Crazy.
crazy for Americans to be on board with. A
Most countries
local
probably. I don't know.
other I think some European countries have higher than that.
Oh, really? Okay.
Um, a localized robot tax, which would be extremely difficult.
And what does that mean? Localized robot tax.
So, like, to tax the robots because they're sort of taking people's jobs and stuff, but it's just very hard to classify what that would be, right? Because,
Hmm.
like, look at like Tim Hortons, right? They have iPads instead of cashiers on some places.
Hmm.
So, do you consider an iPad a robot? Are you just taxing everybody with an iPad now? Right?
Right.
So it's just where do you draw that line?
Yeah, that's
That's
a tough
why I
one.
kind of disagree with.
Yeah, so that's another interesting topic, which I think a lot of people are waiting to hear about is the automation, right? UBI
Hmm.
was initially talked about by Andrew Yang because of this idea that we are going to start losing jobs by the millions very soon to automation. So his main example was that of a truck driver, and truck driving jobs, one of the biggest um, amounts of jobs in the United States for low income workers is, or sorry, low skill workers. Um, is truck driving. And if all of these truck drivers have their jobs automated away, i.e., computers are now driving cars, what are they going to do? Where are they going to turn? And he said retraining simply is not an option, or it had been tried. Like they tried to reinstitute these people into different institutions and retrain them at higher skilled jobs. But these types of people, they don't want to work those jobs. They never liked school. Truck driving was good for them. It was a good fit for them. They weren't going to magically start learning to code,
Yeah,
right? So automation is starting to take away jobs, low income or sorry, low skilled jobs mainly, but it's working its way up. It's getting worse as we found out doing our research. But what are these people going to do? And most of these people, if they don't have a job, they're going to turn to alcohol and drugs. And unfortunately, they're going to kind of get lost in the system. So, what Andrew Yang was saying is listen, we need to float these people some money so they can continue to try to find new opportunities. Maybe they move, maybe they find work somewhere else, but they need a floating amount of money or else they're going to get swallowed up and they're going to get lost. So that was one
yeah,
big issue that we both kind of were looking into a bit when we were doing our research here. So, costing.
yeah. Like just keeping them afloat. Like how we were mentioning how poor people sort of make poor decisions, right? If you keep them sort of out of that for a bit, they'll make better decisions. They'll like maybe go back to school, even though like that's very tough because they,
Hmm.
like you were mentioning, or they'll like having that money makes it a lot easier to transition
Hmm.
because then they'll have a lot less stress,
Yeah,
which is I think is a very important thing because poverty stress can make you lose about like 13 IQ points when it comes to making decisions. And when you're jobless, like they're probably pretty important decisions on where your future is heading.
yeah. This is one thing that I think a lot of people who don't live in poverty don't understand is the stress from financial burdens amongst these individuals who are can barely make ends meet is literally causing such a terrible effect on their mentality and their physical abilities that it's causing them to be, like you said, like unable to make these decisions and resorting to different vices and stuff. So something
Hmm.
that can't be understated is this idea that poverty is what's creating bad habits, not the other way around. Not
Yeah,
bad habits creating
exactly.
poverty. So let's get back to our conversation on costing this. So I, during my research, I think I came to a conclusion that you probably don't agree with, and that's that the universal basic income, if it were to be costed out next year, would not be a good idea. And here's why, and here's what I found. Essentially, essentially, if we're looking at um, paying for welfare systems with that don't include social security and healthcare, you said around $1 trillion. So if we need to come up with 3 trillion from 1 trillion, we would have to cut a lot of these programs, a lot of things like welfare and help for children and maybe disability pay and stuff like that. And what we would do with that money is we would spread it out amongst everybody in the entire country. So instead of taking the money, the 1 trillion, and spending it on people who need it the most, people who are low income or maybe they're just disabled or can't work for whatever reason, and instead of spending it on them, we're spending it on everyone. So it's a redistribution of wealth, and some of the wealth is taken from people who need it the most and given to everyone else. So I thought for that reason, the Andrew Yang style of freedom dividend, $1,000 a month to everyone, was not as financially responsible as maybe you thought it would be. What
I
would you
just
think?
feel like we wouldn't be having this kind of conversation about UBI if the welfare system sort of worked as like as it should, like super well,
Right.
and alleviating poverty.
Hmm.
And that was one of the things that I found in a lot of studies was how good UBI was at reducing poverty and reducing inequality in the countries. Like for Canada, like over 10% of Canadians are in poverty, and poverty is it like reduces the education retention, it adds costs and strain to the healthcare system, and these are sort of the benefits. Like with UBI reducing poverty, it's a huge alleviation on your healthcare system too. So that's sort of adding to the costs of making it sort of cheaper.
Hmm.
And with children benefit a ton with lower poverty, so they'll be able to retain the education and rather than fall through the cracks. So that pretty much adds kind of value as well to the system.
Right. And I think my response to that would be we both agree the welfare system is currently flawed for some reasons, and maybe for some different programs, because welfare is a catch-all term, right? It's saying, okay, here are all this different social programs we put in place. Maybe some of those are better than others. We both agree that it's not working towards a promising goal, and I think what I'm trying to say is we do need to come up with a different system to help individuals, especially if automation is as bad as it says it's going to be. Um, we need to figure out a good system, but is the UBI system where this amount of money is spread out and potentially taken away from people who need it and given to others? Is that the correct system, or do we need to somehow figure out a different system? And I don't have the answer to what that different system would be. I lean towards the negative income tax that was we talked about earlier. I think it would be a lot easier to pay for, like you said, and it would mean less taxes for even those middle class families that are making just more, right? Because they're getting
Hmm.
taxed on those less. Um, do you think that's a better solution, or you still stand by the $1,000 kind of idea?
Well, I'm a fan of both, really. Like I like them both, and sort of either one removing the welfare for negative income tax, it like makes it a lot more simpler and transparent.
Right,
It kind of consolidates it all into one system. Like there's not loads and loads of paperwork, and the welfare trap would essentially be sort of gone. Like it would reduce the government involvement, which would be a lot less kind of money there too. You
right.
sort of begin to treat people like adults, and they'll actually be able to spend the money the way they want. Um, yeah, it just I don't know. I just feel like with those ones, it kind of gives incentives to work,
Hmm.
just because it's more of like an income supplement.
Yeah, and not a benchmark that you have to stay under.
Yeah.
I think another important question for me would be if we're putting this across a developed nation, and this is where I think a developing nation would almost be better for a UBI system because there's less of this territorial. Okay, in California, it costs way more money to live than it does in kind of a rural Nebraska kind of area, right? So, how
Mhm.
would you address, or how should politicians who are making this program address these kind of, okay, I'm living over here, so my cost of living is much higher than living at location B. Do you think the flat amount should be good across all of the developed nation, like in the US? Should it be $1,000 for everyone, or should we try to stagnate depending on where you live? Because, like we said, we want to have less constraints, we want to have less paperwork, but it doesn't equal
Yeah.
out, you know?
That's sort of the tough part that I found, sort of like deciding what I would kind of lean towards. Um like it's so with a lot of the welfare systems I was looking up, it seemed to pay difference in terms of sort of provincial. So for Canada, Ontario welfare system gave out a different amount than BC and
Hmm.
etc. So that sort of um, makes me sort of want to lean towards a different value depending on where for UBI. But I don't know, like usually the cost of living, there's a reason it's that because of the paying of the jobs. So if it's more of like a income supplement, then if you're living in a high cost of living,
area.
That
Yeah.
means your minimum job usually tends to pay more
Right.
to so then your supplement is essentially still the same floor.
Hmm.
So it kind of evens it out no matter where.
Yeah, and that's a good explanation, I think. Um, that kind of satisfies me. I don't know if it would satisfy others when
Hmm.
it comes to fruition. But like I said about developing nations, it's easier for you to say, okay, if we want to institute a UBI system in an African country that's down on its luck, we can easily just do a flat rate across for everyone, and
Yeah.
potentially that would be a solution. So,
The with an argument I feel like towards your one argument with spreading it across everybody rather than just the people that need it.
hmm
I've like I've with with how much the inequality gap is growing, with the wealth being in the hands of such little amounts of people, I feel like the people that need the money is more and more,
yeah, okay,
right?
hmm
So if the wealth is the 1% has like 90 something percent of the wealth, I'm just pulling numbers out of my ass, but that means like there's what 90% of people would probably sort of would like or need this kind of income, this supplement,
hmm
rather than only the 10% that are below the poverty line. Like it helps tremendously to the people that are just over the poverty line too. Like
hmm
they still have almost the same stress, whereas like they can't really take a day off, or they're like sort of in poverty. And so like with this giving the floor that it's raising, it sort of makes society more equal.
yeah. I can give you some numbers here. So, based on a much broader measure of the national income, the pre-tax income of the bottom half of the distribution grew only 1%. So this is the lowest income bracket between 19 only 1% between 1980 and 2014 compared to the top percentage, the top decile increased 121%. So there's some stats for you. And job opportunities have also declined. So since 2000, when employment growth began to slow, between 2000 and 2016, the fraction of individuals aged 25 to 54 working or looking for work fell more than 5 percentage points. So yeah, a lot of data is showing that things are getting worse for those people who are just trying to make ends meet or work in the middle class. So yeah,
Less job opportunity, so the people stuck in welfare can't climb out,
yeah.
and then the cost of the job that they're working to try to get up to better jobs is not making very much because incomes haven't increased in 30, 40 years.
hmm Yeah, stagnation of jobs, of wages, everything. So that was one of that was in part one argument I heard that said, we are worried about automation, we're worried about people losing their jobs to this, but it's already happening, or we're already in this robot apocalypse that is to come. So I mean, it's feasible and it's understandable that it could get worse from here because full-fledged automation could start to kick in. And you were saying that they're automating things that we would never think to automate. What were those, John?
So like I found and there's an AI, it's called like software open AI, specifically GPT-3.
Okay.
It's like a language model of human line text on demand, and it will like create tweets that look like somebody had written, like you would never be able to tell, like short stories, songs, press releases, manuals. It created a web page just off of other ones within minutes. Like it's
Wow.
you would never think that graphic design would be one of the ones that AI would be after already. Like everyone's talking about sort of the factory jobs, the service jobs, but now it's catching up to design and more some of the arts, like is creating these short stories that are like amazing that you would never even tell that a computer written them. Like I thought these were going to be the safe jobs, that these were the ones that we were going to fall back on.
Yeah.
but now it's coming there too, and it I don't know, like I don't know what the future is going to hold, but it just feels like there's going to be less and less job opportunities, right? Because the people create like because back in the industrial era, right, when everyone went from farmers to factory workers, there was a big transition of workforce, but it wasn't a big deal because there wasn't a huge job loss. Everyone sort of just transitioned.
Right.
Now there's a big job loss. Like it only takes a few software engineers to come up with this, a few, but it takes a way less,
A team, yeah.
yeah, than how many people's jobs they're losing. Like there's probably like millions of graphic designers all going to be like gone to AI, but it took like 15 people to make it.
Right.
Where it's like, okay, like sure, people can transition into software and big data and stuff, but it's way fewer people.
Yeah. Yeah, this is something that is scary, and that's why we
Hmm.
were going over this UBI system. Um, I think beyond the costing, which I think we touched on enough, and
Yeah.
beyond the welfare gap, the welfare trap, and the automation, I think there's a few other pretty interesting peripheral questions about what UBI could mean for individuals who are receiving it. And that's something along the lines of freedom. Like, if you are given this money, you now have new freedoms available to you. Do you want to start participating in clubs and societies? You can start giving to fundraisers. You can start taking up new hobbies, stuff like this, stuff that
Hmm.
you might have been held back on before. And with freedom comes happiness, I think. Freedom to explore different avenues. And the other thing I wanted to ask Johnny would be closing the gap between men and women, because if we are giving every individual the same amount, then that means that we're potentially giving, well, we're helping
Yeah.
women to be more equal to men, right?
Yeah. So we're sort of like separating the pay from work. Like,
Right. Yeah.
so with work, like there's certain motivators that are work a lot better. People that enjoy their work and want to do the work and want to volunteer and stuff. That those are good motivators. And the motivators that don't work as good is sort of working for pay, working because you have to, right? So we're with UBI, we sort of go towards having that freedom to work what we want, and it recognizes the women that don't work that take care of their children, right? Because they're getting paid to take care of children, right? So it sort of brings up this equality between men and women and recognizes them for doing jobs that usually are seen as non-paying, which I think is important as well too.
Yeah, I'm going to go ahead and put a huge caveat out here that we don't think that women should not participate in the workforce. We definitely do. I
Hmm.
don't want to sound sexist to say that they should stay home and work from home and only do that. We're just
Yeah.
saying that if you are in that scenario, or you're in a country that doesn't have so like paternity leave and maternity leave, where let's say you don't have the men getting a paternity leave, so they don't get to come home from work and still get a same payoff. Let's say you're in one of those countries, that means that you're still, if you're receiving UBI, you're still receiving income, and you're still able to have some freedom to stay home and be with your kids. Um, so yeah, that's what that means, and it helps with the equality fight. I would think, right?
Hmm.
It's a step forward for women's rights and women's equality.
I've heard like arguments made for giving the labor, like the workers, more power as well. So like you say you're getting UBI and you're just treated like absolute garbage at your work. You hate your boss is just like you hate your boss and you're just not having a good time at work or whatever. You could just quit and you have that security to sort of find another job, right?
Yeah,
So if so then all these people are going to be quitting all these shitty jobs, then these employers are going to be like, "Oh my god, we need people to work these jobs. We actually have to make these jobs worthwhile. We
right.
can't just be treating people like garbage."
Yeah,
Um and another one I think that gets like not brought up all that much either is it sort of helps with like environmental safety and sustainability. And so say like with like buying organic, right? It's sort of expensive,
Hmm.
or buying like more fresh food, healthy food is a little more expensive than just buying straight processed food, right? So nutrition would increase with UBI because you have that extra bit of money that you can spend on better food.
Right.
You
Especially
can
if,
you can
yeah.
buy organic, you can sort of support the local farmer rather than the big agriculture businesses.
Hmm.
Um,
Especially if you
you
institute
could
that sugar tax you were talking about.
Yeah, you can make more sustainable choices like buying certain products because they're sustainable for earth.
Right.
Just because they're a little more expensive, you have that fallback. So
Hmm.
that's why it's not, I think it's beneficial not only just for the extremely impoverished people, but that helps the other people make better decisions too.
Right.
Like
Yeah.
it helps reduce the poverty, brings everyone closer with inequality.
Hmm.
Everyone's in the same sort of floor, and then it helps all these other factors as well.
Yeah, I think the other thing that I think we forgot to mention on downsides to UBI would be inflation of cost of certain goods and services, right? So if everyone's receiving $1,000, then it could be possible that goods and services would raise their prices. McDonald's says, "Oh, everyone's got $1,000. Well, now Big Mac costs an extra $2, kind of thing, right?" So
Hmm.
that could be an issue, but I think the main way that gets sorted out is that if everybody has more money, then people are spending more money, right?
Yeah,
Maybe if you really want to get that tattoo you couldn't save for, well, now you're getting a tattoo. That money goes to him. Now he's spending his money on more food and goods, so the money gets recirculated back into the economy a lot quicker,
yeah,
and that way it keeps prices down, right? So for if people have money to spend, people want to spend money on the cheapest thing, or they want to be frugal or whatever. It makes it push businesses to continue to either keep the costs around the same or lower them a bit to be more competitive. So yeah, I think inflation is not going to be a big issue. Just to tie a bow on all the arguments against it. Um,
yeah. And with that, like the money that people are going to be getting with the government, it most likely will be put back into the economy. There's like a flypaper effect, it's called, and it's essentially that government issued grants, government issued money is it's more likely to be spent over personal income, so it actually drives economic growth, and because people are spending that money that the government gives, so it's essentially going back in the economy anyways.
yeah, people don't just sit on the government money; they start
Yeah,
spending
they
it.
rather spend that money than their personal income, so
Hmm.
essentially the money that the government's giving out is would be
Yeah,
hypothetically coming back.
yeah. All right, Johnny, do you have anything else to add about the UBI
Well,
systems?
yeah, well, there's like I I wanted to mention this earlier, but with like sort of the freedom, right?
Hmm.
It's like a story that I enjoyed, and with Harper Lee, the author of To Kill a Mockingbird.
Hmm.
So in the 1950s, she liked to write in her free time, but she didn't make any money with writing, so she had to work as an airplane clerk to support herself. On Christmas one year, a friend gifted her a year's worth of wages with a note, and it said, "1 year off to write whatever you please." And during that year, she wrote To Kill a Mockingbird,
Yeah.
which sold like over 30 million copies, and you can make arguments for one of the best novels of the century. And so if she didn't have that freedom to do what she loved, to go all full blown into writing, we wouldn't have To Kill a Mockingbird. We wouldn't have some of these like crazy, like amazing stories that
Hmm.
we learned about in school. You wouldn't even have that card game probably.
No, definitely wouldn't.
So like it's just like stories like that that I like about sort of the freedom and kind of having the time to do what, like doing the work that you want to do.
Hmm. Yeah, it's a huge influencing factor, especially when you're trying to sell the idea, right? I mean, this kind of thing is only instituted by big governments, and if we want to get this passed, we have to make the case. And Andrew Yang being the first one to come out on a huge scale to make the case really opened a lot of people's eyes to the idea. And I think
Hmm.
as interesting as it is, it's not going to get through unless we are able to sell a huge swath of people on it. And stories like that, they're not just anecdotal, they're real for a lot of people. You know what I mean? Like
Yeah.
this type of thing is something that is tangible to them. It's not $1,000, it's an opportunity, right?
Yeah, exactly. That's a
So
big point.
yeah, I think that that could be a swaying factor. I think the only issue is literally politics and what you have to give up, be it in money, be it in programs, and
Yeah.
trying to divide the wealth as appropriately as possible to the people who need it the most. Um, I
Yeah, I think that's just the big thing is the cost is sort of the kind of the unfortunate aspect
mhm,
because it's so easy to just gun down because of the cost, right? And it's like hard to be like, yeah, but like you have a case because of the cost, right? Like,
mhm. And it's unfortunate because it certainly would be a more. I mean, this all begins with a book named Utopia, right? A utopian idea that everybody has money given to them just
mm-hmm,
for existing, right? To help support future endeavors and continue to work and give back to society.
mm-hmm.
Um, I think that's all I had. All my thoughts on UBI. Do you have any final notes for us, Johnny?
I think we covered majority of what I wrote is mostly just sort of one-offs here and there of just sort of the studies and stuff. I guess I'll just rifle off some of the sources and studies that I looked up and stuff. If
Sure.
people want to do sort of re, further reading, um, so Robert Bregman, he's a big like economist historian on that's a big advocate for UBI and 15-hour work week and etc. He has a book called Utopia for Realists. I think it's a solid book. He goes through a lot of the studies that I went through, and he definitely makes a really good case. Like Andrew Yang talked a lot about his freedom dividend. um, there was a study in Mincom, Manitoba, that went on for like a year. That was a real UBI. Alaska has a lot of studies on it because it was going on for so long. The that Brazil family thing,
Oh yeah,
you
that
might know the name of it.
that was called the Bos La Familia, and essentially it was if you would receive a certain amount of money if you had a child that was vaccinated and in school. So
Gotcha.
it was pretty simple,
Um,
but it was very
yeah,
popular.
Ontario had a pilot study. Finland had pilot studies. Lots of free cash transfers in Kenya. Give directly. You'd be able to find them there on their website. There's there's it's a website called basicincome.org. Loads of stuff on that website about UBI. Um, yeah, you can find the letter pretty easily that was sent to
Hmm.
Congress with the Economist. That's pretty fascinating read I found. But yeah, I'll try to include most of it in sort of a show notes.
Yeah, for sure.
But I think that covers everything.
I think at the end of my research, I was leaning more towards a negative income tax as a more realistic starting point
Yeah,
for kind of more developed nations. I know you would want to go hard and fast on this and try to get it to more of a freedom dividend idea. Maybe that the price is not exactly $1,000 or whatever, but something along
yeah,
those lines. Like, I think in conclusion, we're both advocates for a change along the lines of a universal basic income. We probably go about it different ways,
yeah.
but I
But
think,
that's sort of like the beauty of it is there's no just one distinct way. Like you were mentioning at near the beginning of all the different sort of questions and ways you could sort of build this system.
yeah.
That's what sort of makes it sort of fascinating too. And
Hmm.
it's something that will evolve as years go on because like right now, like maybe I want only like 8,500 for the year because we still have jobs, but maybe in 15 years unemployment rate will skyrocket and that number will have to be a lot more, right?
Yeah, and it'll go from a partial basic income to a full basic income, and people will almost not have to work, right? And
Yeah.
that'll be kind of normal now. It'll become a simple thing as okay, we're just increasing the UBI a bit more now, and everybody's oh, sounds good, we're on board.
Yeah.
Um, yeah, okay, I think that's it from us for this episode of Inquisitive Minds. Thank you so much for listening, and we'll see you here back next time where we give you something interesting to think about. Thanks.